Imagine this. It's 1945. The Second World War has finally come to an end. Across Europe, cities lie in ruins. Millions are dead. The Nazi regime has collapsed, and the world believes justice is finally about to begin. The most dangerous men in Germany are expected to stand trial for the crimes they helped make possible. But behind closed doors, something completely different is happening. While the public celebrates victory, American intelligence officers are quietly searching through destroyed laboratories, hidden military bunkers, and abandoned research facilities. They're not looking for gold. They're not searching for weapons. They're hunting people. Scientists. Men who once worked for Adolf Hitler. Some helped build terrifying new weapons. Some conducted research for the Nazi military. Others had dark pasts connected to one of history's most brutal regimes. Instead of putting all of them on trial, the United States made a secret decision. A decision that would change the future of the Cold War. The space race. Modern military technology. And perhaps even the world we live in today. For decades, most Americans had no idea this operation even existed. Its documents were classified. Its true scale remained hidden. And many of the names involved quietly disappeared into ordinary American life. How could the country that fought against Nazi Germany end up secretly bringing hundreds of German scientists into the United States? Who approved this mission? How many secrets were buried? And was it a necessary decision to protect America? Or one of the darkest moral compromises in modern history? Tonight, we're uncovering the hidden story behind one of America's most controversial secret programs. Operation Paperclip. A story where the line between justice and survival became dangerously blurred. When Germany fell, the hunt began, 2 to 4 o'clock. May 1945. Berlin had fallen. The Third Reich was finished. Adolf Hitler was dead, Germany had surrendered, and across Europe the war was finally coming to an end. For millions of people, it felt like history had closed one of its darkest chapters. But for the United States, the end of the war marked the beginning of an entirely different race. American military leaders knew something that most civilians did not. Germany had spent years developing technology far ahead of its time. Its engineers had created the world's first operational ballistic missile, the V-2 rocket. German laboratories had made major advances in aerodynamics, jet propulsion, guided weapons, and military medicine. If that knowledge disappeared, or worse, if it fell into the hands of another powerful nation, the next war could begin before the world had even recovered from the last one. And there was one country the United States feared above all others. The Soviet Union. Although America and the Soviet Union had fought on the same side against Nazi Germany, the alliance was already beginning to crack. Mutual distrust was growing. Both nations understood that whoever controlled Germany's scientists could gain an enormous technological advantage. What followed wasn't just a search for documents. It became a race against time. American intelligence teams spread across defeated Germany, entering abandoned research centers, military bases, underground factories, and hidden laboratories before Soviet forces could reach them. Boxes of research papers were loaded onto trucks. Rocket parts were carefully packed and shipped away. Entire laboratories were dismantled. But the most valuable prize wasn't equipment. It was the people who had designed it. Every captured engineer, physicist, chemist, and rocket expert represented years of knowledge that couldn't simply be recreated. As the competition intensified, American officials faced an uncomfortable question. Could these scientists really be trusted? Many had worked directly for Hitler's government. Some had been members of Nazi organizations. Others claimed they had simply followed orders. Separating truth from self-preservation was almost impossible. Yet with Soviet troops advancing across Eastern Europe, Washington feared hesitation more than controversy. The race for Germany's greatest scientific minds had already begun. And before long, the United States would make a decision so controversial that it would remain hidden from much of the public for decades. As American forces gathered thousands of German documents and interviewed captured scientists, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. If these experts were left behind, the Soviet Union would almost certainly recruit them first. In Washington, military officials argued that the United States couldn't afford to lose this race. National security, they believed, depended on acquiring Germany's scientific knowledge before anyone else could. But there was a serious problem. Many of the scientists they wanted had worked for the Nazi regime. Under existing U.S. policy, individuals closely connected to the Nazi Party or its organizations were generally not supposed to be admitted into the United States. That obstacle threatened the entire plan. So, behind closed doors, government officials began creating a new program. At first, it carried a different name. Soon, it became known as Operation Paperclip. According to widely accepted historical accounts, the name came from the paperclips attached to certain personnel files as officials reviewed and processed selected scientists for recruitment. The operation was conducted with a high level of secrecy. Its goal was simple, but controversial. Identify scientists considered valuable to American military and technological interests. Bring them to the United States. And put their expertise to work before the Soviet Union could do the same. Some of the recruits arrived with their families. Others signed contracts to continue their research under American supervision. Many were sent to military bases, research centers, and testing facilities where they resumed work, this time for their former enemy. To the American public, very little of this was visible. Newspapers focused on rebuilding Europe. The famous war crimes trials captured the world's attention. Meanwhile, hundreds of German specialists quietly began new lives in America. Not every scientist recruited through Operation Paperclip had the same background. Some had limited political involvement. Others had deeper ties to Nazi institutions, and historians continue to debate the extent of individual responsibility in certain cases. That distinction remains an important part of the story. Operation Paperclip was not simply about science. It forced the United States to confront a difficult moral question. Could a democracy dedicated to justice justify working with people who had served one of history's most brutal regimes? If doing so might protect the nation's future? It was a question with no easy answer. And among all the scientists brought to America, one name would become more famous than the rest. A brilliant rocket engineer whose inventions would eventually help send humans to the moon. But his past would remain the subject of debate for decades. Among the hundreds of German specialists recruited through Operation Paperclip, one man would become the public face of American space exploration. His name was Wernher von Braun. Long before Americans watched astronauts walk on the moon, von Braun had already become one of the world's leading rocket engineers. During World War II, he worked on Germany's V-2 rocket program. Technologically, the V-2 was decades ahead of its time. It became the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile and demonstrated capabilities that would later influence both military missiles and space rockets. But behind this remarkable achievement was a far darker reality. Many V-2 rockets were manufactured using forced labor at underground facilities. Historians estimate that thousands of prisoners died from brutal working conditions, starvation, disease, and abuse while producing these weapons. The human cost was catastrophic. The extent of von Braun's personal responsibility has been debated by historians for decades. There is broad agreement that he held an important leadership role in the rocket program and was aware of the conditions surrounding production. However, historians continue to discuss how much authority he had over the treatment of forced laborers and the decisions made inside the Nazi system. Those debates continue today. When Germany collapsed in 1945, von Braun understood that surrendering to American forces offered a far better future than being captured by the Soviet Union. He and several members of his team voluntarily approached U.S. troops. American officials quickly recognized the value of their knowledge. Within months, von Braun and many of his colleagues were transported to the United States under Operation Paperclip. At first, their work focused on military research. Captured V-2 rockets were carefully reassembled and tested in the deserts of New Mexico. American engineers studied every component. Every launch revealed new lessons. The knowledge gained from these experiments became a foundation for future missile development. Years passed. The world entered the Cold War. Then, in 1957, everything changed. The Soviet Union successfully launched the world's first artificial satellite. Suddenly, America found itself behind in the space race. The same German engineers once recruited in secret were now viewed as some of the nation's greatest scientific assets. Von Braun was given an even larger role in America's rapidly expanding space program. Eventually, he became one of the leading architects behind the powerful Saturn V rocket, the vehicle that would carry astronauts toward the moon. To millions of Americans, he became a national hero. But hidden beneath that inspiring story was a question that never completely disappeared. Could extraordinary scientific achievement ever erase a deeply controversial past? Or would Operation Paperclip forever remain a reminder that history is rarely as simple as heroes and villains? As the years passed, one image came to define Operation Paperclip. Brilliant scientists, groundbreaking technology, and America's journey toward the moon. But that image told only part of the story. Behind the scenes, Operation Paperclip was much larger than the public realized. Over time, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, technicians, and their family members were brought to the United States through the program. Not all of them built rockets. Some specialized in aviation. Others worked on chemistry, medicine, submarines, missile guidance, or military engineering. Each was chosen because American officials believed their knowledge could provide an advantage during the rapidly growing Cold War. But every recruitment came with another question. What had these people done before the war ended? As intelligence officers reviewed thousands of pages of military records, they discovered that the answers were rarely simple. Some scientists insisted they had joined Nazi organizations only because refusing could end their careers, or even put their lives at risk. Others argued they had focused only on science, not politics. Yet historical records also showed that certain recruits had held memberships in Nazi organizations, while others had worked closely with military programs that relied on forced labor or supported the German war effort. American officials understood the risk. If the public learned that former Nazi-affiliated specialists were being welcomed into the United States, the political backlash could be enormous. According to historical records, some personnel files were revised or re-evaluated as officials weighed security concerns against the scientists' value to American research. The details varied from case to case, and historians continue to study exactly how those decisions were made. What is clear is that national security often took priority over complete transparency. The message inside Washington was becoming increasingly straightforward. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence. Every month mattered. Every scientist mattered. If America rejected these experts, Moscow might recruit them instead. To government leaders, the choice seemed painfully practical. To many others, it raised a troubling moral question. Was protecting the future worth overlooking parts of the past? That question has never received a universally accepted answer. Even today, historians continue to debate whether Operation Paperclip was a necessary Cold War strategy, or a compromise that came at a profound ethical cost. As decades passed, another layer of secrecy slowly began to crack. Classified files were opened. Forgotten documents resurfaced. And the American public started learning that the story behind Operation Paperclip was far more complex than the version many had grown up hearing. The secrets were finally beginning to emerge. For years, Operation Paperclip remained largely invisible to the American public. The scientists continued their work. New rockets were tested. Military technology advanced. And eventually, America reached the moon. To most people, these achievements appeared to be nothing more than remarkable examples of scientific progress. Few knew the full story behind the men who helped make them possible. But secrets rarely stay buried forever. As the decades passed, government records slowly began to emerge. Previously classified documents were declassified. Historians gained access to military archives. Journalists started connecting pieces of a story that had remained hidden since the end of World War II. The picture that emerged was far more complicated than many Americans expected. Operation Paperclip had never been just a scientific project. It had also been a political gamble. Researchers discovered that U.S. officials had often faced an impossible choice. Should they reject talented scientists because of their past? Or recruit them to prevent those same experts from strengthening the Soviet Union? There was no decision without consequences. As more evidence became public, historians began asking difficult questions. Did the United States fully investigate every scientist before recruiting them? Were some backgrounds minimized because their knowledge was considered too valuable to lose? Could national security ever justify making exceptions that would have been unacceptable under normal circumstances? These questions sparked decades of debate. Some historians argue that without Operation Paperclip, the Soviet Union might have gained a decisive technological advantage during the Cold War. Others believe that recruiting individuals connected to the Nazi regime compromised the very principles the Allies claimed to defend. Both perspectives continue to be discussed today. Why? One thing, however, is beyond dispute. Operation Paperclip helped shape modern American science. Its influence reached military research, ballistic missile development, jet aviation, and eventually, the U.S. space program. The operation left behind an extraordinary scientific legacy. But it also left behind an equally extraordinary ethical debate. Perhaps the greatest lesson wasn't about rockets, or weapons, or even the Cold War. It was about the difficult choices nations sometimes make when fear, survival, and morality collide. And as more classified documents continue to be studied by historians, the story of Operation Paperclip remains unfinished. Because every newly uncovered document has the potential to reveal another piece of one of America's most controversial secrets. By the 1960s, the world had entered a new kind of battlefield. This time, the weapons weren't just bombs. They were rockets, satellites, and the race to reach space before anyone else. Every successful launch became a symbol of national power. Every technological breakthrough sent a message to the world. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, shockwaves spread across the United States. For the first time, Americans realized they were losing the space race. Washington responded immediately. Billions of dollars were invested in science, engineering, and space exploration. The newly created space agency, NASA, became the center of that effort. And many of the engineers working on America's most ambitious rocket programs had arrived years earlier through Operation Paperclip. Their knowledge helped accelerate American rocket technology at a critical moment in history. After years of testing, failures, and relentless innovation, the United States achieved what once seemed impossible. On July 20, 1969, human beings walked on the moon. For millions watching around the world, it was one of humanity's greatest achievements. Few viewers, however, knew that part of the technology behind that historic mission had roots stretching back to wartime Germany. That realization continues to make many historians uncomfortable. How should history remember Operation Paperclip? As a brilliant strategic decision that helped protect America during the Cold War? Or as a moral compromise that sacrificed justice in the name of national security? Even today, there is no universal answer. Some believe the operation prevented the Soviet Union from gaining an overwhelming scientific advantage. Others argue that recruiting individuals connected to the Nazi regime sent a dangerous message, that extraordinary talent could sometimes outweigh accountability. Perhaps both views count. I'm part of the truth. History is rarely divided into heroes and villains. More often, it is shaped by impossible choices made during impossible times. Operation Paperclip reminds us that scientific progress and ethical responsibility do not always move together. Sometimes, the greatest achievements of civilization are built upon decisions that remain deeply controversial for generations. And perhaps that is why this story still fascinates historians nearly 80 years later. Because the real question was never simply whether America won the space race. The real question is, what price was paid to win it? History often celebrates victories. The rockets. The discoveries. The moon landing. But behind every great achievement, there are stories that history doesn't always tell. While former German scientists were beginning new lives in the United States, millions of survivors across Europe were trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered by war. Entire families had disappeared. Cities lay in ruins. The scars of the Holocaust and Nazi occupation would last for generations. For many survivors, justice meant holding those responsible accountable. The Nuremberg trials had shown the world that war crimes would not simply be forgotten. Leading Nazi officials were prosecuted before an international court. It seemed that a new era of justice had begun. Yet at the very same time, another reality was unfolding behind closed doors. Some scientists considered valuable to American national security were being interviewed, vetted, and quietly transported to the United States. To many people, this created a painful contradiction. How could one part of the government prosecute members of the Nazi regime, while another recruited specialists who had worked within that same system? There was no simple answer. American officials argued that the world had changed. The war against Germany was over. A new conflict, the Cold War, had already begun. The Soviet Union was rapidly expanding its military and scientific capabilities. In Washington, many believed that refusing to recruit German experts would simply allow Moscow to do so instead. It was no longer a question of punishment. It had become a question of survival. Not everyone agreed. Critics argued that scientific knowledge should never outweigh moral responsibility. They believed that justice loses its meaning when exceptions are made for people with valuable skills. Supporters reached the opposite conclusion. They argued that governments sometimes face impossible choices. If those scientists could prevent another global war, or help protect millions of lives, then perhaps recruiting them was the lesser of two evils. Decades later, that debate has never truly ended. Universities still study Operation Paperclip. Historians continue examining newly released documents. Ethicists ask whether national security can ever justify overlooking a controversial past. There is still no universal answer. Perhaps that's what makes this story so powerful. It forces us to confront a question with no comfortable conclusion. If history gave you the same choice, would you choose justice? Or would you choose security? Sometimes, the darkest chapters of history are not remembered because the answers are clear. They are remembered because they aren't. Nearly 80 years have passed since Operation Paperclip began. The Cold War has ended. The Berlin Wall has fallen. Many of the people directly involved are no longer alive. Yet the questions raised by this secret operation have never disappeared. Today, Operation Paperclip is studied in universities, examined in military academies, and debated by historians around the world. Not because it was the largest secret program in American history, but because it exposed one of the most difficult choices a democracy can face. How far should a nation go to protect itself? Should scientific brilliance ever outweigh moral responsibility? Can national security justify decisions that would otherwise be unacceptable? These questions did not end in 1945. They continue to shape government policy even today. Modern intelligence agencies still compete to recruit the world's brightest scientists. Nations still race to develop advanced technologies before their rivals. Artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, quantum computing, space exploration. The technologies have changed, but the competition has not. Operation Paperclip serves as a reminder that history often repeats itself in new forms. Every generation believes its challenges are unique. Yet the same ethical dilemmas return again and again. Security, power, innovation, and the price society is willing to pay for them. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this story isn't what happened decades ago. It's realizing that similar questions still confront governments today. The names may be different. The technologies may be more advanced. But the choices remain remarkably familiar. When fear collides with morality, history rarely offers perfect solutions. It only records the decisions that were made, and leaves future generations to judge them. That is why Operation Paperclip remains more than a forgot. 10 chapter of World War II. It has become a warning. A reminder that behind every great technological achievement, there may be a story the public never sees. And sometimes, the most powerful secrets are not the ones hidden forever. They are the ones revealed only after history has already been changed. History often tells us who won. It tells us who lost. It celebrates the greatest inventions, the biggest victories, and the moments that changed the world forever. But sometimes, the most important part of history isn't what happened. It's how it happened. Operation Paperclip was never just about rockets. It was never just about scientists. And it was never simply about the Cold War. It was about a choice. A choice made in one of the most uncertain moments in modern history. A choice between justice and national security. One that historians, politicians, and ordinary people still debate nearly 80 years later. Without Operation Paperclip, would America have reached the moon as quickly? No one can answer that with certainty. Would the Soviet Union have gained an even greater technological advantage? Again, no one truly knows. History doesn't allow us to replay the past. It only allows us to study it. Perhaps that's why stories like this continue to fascinate us. Because they remind us that history is rarely black and white. Behind every headline, behind every famous achievement, there are hidden decisions, hidden documents, and hidden consequences. Some changed the course of nations. Others changed the course of humanity itself. Operation Paperclip was one of those decisions. Not because everyone agrees with it, but because almost no one can ignore its impact. The rockets that once carried weapons across Europe eventually carried human beings toward the moon. The same knowledge that was born during one of humanity's darkest wars helped create one of its greatest achievements. History is full of contradictions. And perhaps, that is its greatest lesson. The past cannot be changed. But it can be understood. The more we uncover, the more we realize that the truth is often stranger, more complicated, and darker than we ever imagined. If this story made you question what you thought you knew about history, then there are many more hidden stories waiting to be uncovered. From forgotten government experiments, to mysterious disappearances, to secret operations that remained buried for decades. This is only the beginning. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video, because it helps more people discover these forgotten chapters of history. Subscribe to Dark History Archives and turn on notifications, so you never miss the next investigation into the world's darkest and most mysterious historical secrets.